For listeners and viewers of Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.tv, Webster Griffin Tarpley really needs no introduction. But it is important for some who don't know who Mr. Tarpley is to tell them that he is an accomplished author, researcher. He has, of course, degrees in history and economics. And so now our interview, in depth, never before seen, with Webster Griffin Tarpley.
When we look at the environmental fanatics, the ecological extremists, the Malthusians and neo-Malthusians of the Obama regime, we will see that one of their common denominators is a hatred for science, technology, and industry. They believe that there are only two main problems for human civilization. They would say those two problems are overpopulation and industrial pollution. And everything they do comes from a desire to restrain population growth or to reduce population. And they're willing to contemplate means that we can only describe as genocide. And then industrial pollution. And they've gone from their hysteria about chlorofluorocarbons, and then the ozone hole, acid rain, and today their favorite topic, of course, is the greenhouse effect, global warming, carbon footprints, and so forth. What they are expressing with this is, of course, from the scientific point of view, the work of charlatans, fanatics, obscurantists, irrationalists, and so forth. But this is a deep-seated ideological impulse of oligarchy per se. If you go back to the Greek historians, in the time of Thucydides, and we're talking about 400 BC, in the time of Thucydides, and sometimes thought to be Thucydides, but it's a separate person, there's a writer called the Old Oligarch. He has no name. We don't know what his name was, but he's called the Old Oligarch. And the Old Oligarch writes that he hates the Athenian Navy because the Athenian Navy is a high-technology operation, and it's allowing social mobility for plebeian and proletarian types from the lower classes, and thereby threatening the class privileges of people like the Old Oligarch. He also says that he hates the long walls that were built from Athens to Piraeus, so that Athens could be relatively invulnerable to land attacks by the army of Sparta, which of course was the most oligarchical of all the Greek states. So if we look at the Old Oligarch, he hates technology, and he wants oligarchical foreign armies to come in and take over his own country so that he can keep his privileges. This same impulse is what we see expressed in the modern environmentalist fanaticism of people who think that industry itself is a problem. The finance oligarch looks at industry as an object of asset stripping. He wants to get his hands on it so that he can liquidate it and make a bundle of money in the process. The other aspect of what these people believe is that the world is always overpopulated. And this does not depend on the empirical state of the world from any point of view. If you go back to the treatment of the Trojan War in Greek literature, you will see that the official explanation, why did there have to be a Trojan War for 10 years, killing all those people between the Greeks and the Trojans? And the answer in certain oligarchical writers of Greece is that the world was overpopulated. There were too many humans pressing down on the breast of Mother Earth, and they had to be exterminated. And the Trojan War was the chosen means of doing that. So the prejudices of the oligarchy are timeless. They hate science, they hate technology, they hate industry, and they're also convinced that the world is overpopulated. In the 19th century, maybe in the wake of the Krakatoa volcanic eruption, which caused some cloud cover around the world for a couple of years, although it was a purely natural process, you had writers like John Ruskin and a group of proto-fascists and extremists among British academia who came out then with the additional idea that pollution was the principal product of human society. And this was obviously a way to attack industrialism, to blame pollution on industry. This is Ruskin's infamous storm cloud of the 19th century and related things. And since then, The British oligarchy, naturally, is the most extreme expression of these tendencies up to the time of Prince Philip, right, who says that if he could, he would like to be reincarnated as a deadly virus to come back and kill people and solve the problem of global overpopulation. Now, I submit that not even Hitler goes quite as far as Prince Philip in public statements, at least about what it is that he wants to do. In the autumn of 2009, we've had some important international financial meetings. We've had the Group of 20 meeting in Pittsburgh, and we've had the Istanbul annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund. And out of this emerges, I think, a political project of the U.S. British oligarchs joined by the European Central Bank and their followers in Japan, which comes down to this. The International Monetary Fund will be made into the center of a world economic dictatorship. Back in the 1920s and 30s, Lord Montague Norman of the Bank of England was called the currency dictator of Europe. Well, this time around, the currency dictator of the world is Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the former finance minister of France, who is the boss of the International Monetary Fund, and within that same orbit, you've got the World Bank and a series of other institutions. And the way they want to do this is to make the IMF the central bank of all central banks. So we have the Federal Reserve, bad enough, European Central Bank, extremely bad, Bank of Japan, also bad, but above them, yet another layer of oligarchical power plastered on top of the Fed, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan is the IMF, with regulatory capabilities, but also as a lender of last resort to the national central banks. Let's assume we had a panic run on the Federal Reserve. Perfectly feasible. It already happened in 1932 to 1933 when you had the great Herbert Hoover U.S. banking crisis. There were a lot of banks who were members of the Federal Reserve who had put money in and wanted to get it out. And if that had continued through 1933, you would have had a panic run on the Federal Reserve. So now what we've got is the idea of the IMF being able to come in as the lender of last resort for national central banks, except you don't get that money from the IMF for free. If the IMF gets on your case, you are required to sign a letter of intent in which you express your commitment to observe the conditionalities of the IMF. And they have a very specific economic doctrine. It's called the Washington Consensus, and that is deregulation, privatization, the destruction of your social safety net. It would mean union busting. If you have a state sector, they want to destroy that. They want to have the race to the bottom across the board. Now, what happens if the U.S. goes bankrupt and has to turn to the IMF for loans? At that point, U.S. sovereignty ceases to exist, and you're going to have Dominique Strauss-Kahn or some similar cosmopolitan finance oligarch sitting in Washington, because here's where the IMF is, but imposing a worldwide financial dictatorship on the U.S., with, of course, the British having the inside track to the kind of stuff that gets done. It's ironic because the money that the IMF uses comes from the member states. Most people are not aware that among its many crimes, and this is one of the worst crimes, the Obama regime has transferred 100 billion U.S. dollars to the International Monetary Fund. At the same time that California was collapsing, Illinois was going to hell, New York was facing bankruptcy, and communities across the nation were experiencing tremendous hardships. Obama finds $100 billion for the IMF. Now, what do they do with that? The currency for the New World Finance Dictatorship is already there. It's special drawing rights, SDRs. This is something that emerged after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, after Nixon destroyed Bretton Woods with British assistance in August 15th, 1971. They created special drawing rights. They called it paper gold. Of course, it's not gold. At the beginning, it was a basket of currencies. That has evolved. It's a purely paper creation. You can go to the website of the International Monetary Fund any day, and you will see all of the currencies of the world expressed as SDRs, in terms of special drawing rights. So that's your supranational currency, and the U.S. has already given $100 billion to prop that up. And that's in the program of $1 trillion that has been pledged by the other main financial powers, by the Japanese, the Europeans, and others. So they're hoping to stock up on $1 trillion total in various currencies and use that as reserves to back up the special drawing rights. Now, there's nothing worse than this. The mentality of this IMF is called the Washington Consensus. They have no success stories to point to. They always fail. They always increase poverty, increase economic backwardness, shut down industries, increase unemployment, and so on down the line. From Bolivia to Poland to Russia in the 1990s. IMF shock therapy is widely regarded as economic death. Argentina, a couple of years ago, owed the IMF $10 billion, and they realized the only way to get their economy in order was to get out from under the IMF, get the IMF out of their country, off their case. So President Kirchner of Argentina borrowed $10 billion from Chavez of Venezuela to pay off the IMF and get them out. Countries are generally much better off borrowing from another country, from a peer, rather than borrowing from this overreaching, overarching, supranational, dictatorial empire that comes in and tells you what to do. This has gone so far that the Washington Consensus is being widely rejected. Nobody wants to go under this. There's now the Beijing Consensus. And the Beijing Consensus goes like this. First of all, don't interfere in the internal affairs of sovereign states. And we want that for ourselves. We better give it to others. And the second point is 50-50, everything equal. No overwhelming advantage for one side or the other. So the special drawing rights is what is happening. There are other hypothetical options, fallback options, back burner options, regional currencies and things like this. But what is actually going on in the world, and what you've given $100 billion for, is special drawing rights, SDRs. We're in a dollar crisis, and there's no doubt that we're in a dollar crisis. It is impossible now for the US dollar to remain the single world reserve currency. The US dollar cannot do that anymore. The problem is, if you look at the other candidates, the euro and the yen, we see that they are less able to be the sole unique world reserve currency. And the worst of all possible worlds is a synthetic supranational currency like the special drawing rights. If we go back to 1944 at Bretton Woods, Lord Keynes, a very evil British imperialist with left cover, came to Bretton Woods in 1944 to try to undermine the dollar and attack the dollar. He proposed something called Bancor, and Bancor is pretty much special drawing rights. It was a synthetic imperialist currency unit that would be used as a world reserve currency. Keynes wanted to prevent countries from having balance of payment surpluses. He wanted to stop them from developing by preventing them from exporting. This is typical British imperialist thinking represented by Keynes. So people today have to realize that the proposal to create a synthetic, hoked up, supranational currency is the worst possible outcome. Now, President Medvedev of Russia showed this coin at a recent international summit. I'm sure President Medvedev knows better than anybody that that coin is not by any stretch of the imagination going to represent a world reserve currency. I think what he's trying to do is to prod the United States and others into constructive negotiations on this subject, which should happen. Naturally, you're going to have to do some pulling of teeth, right? Obama, Geithner, Summers, Volcker, these characters are hysterically, fanatically opposed to any kind of constructive negotiation. And then you've got the British, who would like to blow up the entire world system and play last man standing. In other words, to play the card of chaos and confusion in the world monetary system with the hope that the dollar goes down, the euro goes down, the yen goes down, the ruble goes down, and believe it or not, the decrepit, withered mummy of the British pound is the last man standing.